Let's talk about cleaning up your technical debt. Technical debt is the bane of many developers. Now, many times when we're building software, we make these decisions and we choose expediency over great design. We have to get our stuff done. And then we have to live with the limitations of our code. It's a constant problem in software development. I don't ever see it going away. And what happens is, over time, our code becomes more difficult to maintain. It's harder and harder to make choices. We worry about breakage, and so we limit our future development options. That's technical debt. Many software development methodologies have evolved over the years to work with technical debt. And DevOps isn't prescriptive. It doesn't tell you how to work with it, just that we should get better over time. And so one of the more popular ideas in many of the agile methodologies is that periodically a team will pause new work and clean up their old code. Other methodologies will try to encourage constant cleanup as developers work. Others still ignore the problems and hope it never becomes a big enough issue to stop their development because they assume they'll always build new things in their application. That's wishful thinking, but it's still the way that some companies deal with issues. In the DevOps world, we've got a number of progressive companies that have shown us good habits and good practices, and they've had a lot of success. Often they begin their journey with a complete cleanup of old code, and that's something you may consider when you start implementing the DevOps process with your database. Still others abandon technical debt and they just rewrite their entire system. That's often not the case with databases, but it does happen at times. Sometimes people will just completely rebuild a database and migrate all their data over. However, it's more common that we can't do that. Most of us don't have that luxury. Most of us need to manage our debt over time and slowly evolve our code. That means that we want to be sure that we identify those areas where we can clean up code. One of the common causes of technical debt in databases is that we have incomplete database changes. We've added columns, we've started to change the way our database works, but we haven't finished. That's because some of our database changes take place over time, and we either forget or we become afraid to make those changes. Common example may be when I split a column. Let's say I have an address column that has plenty of information in it, and I want to split that up so that I have the street number, the street name, the unit number as separate fields. Problem is, I have an application that uses that full address column. It may query it, it may insert data there, so I can't remove that immediately. So I'll add my 3 columns and I'll keep the other one. And then what I have to do is build a trigger to ensure that the data is kept in sync, or maybe even 2 triggers to ensure that new parts of my application that insert into 3 columns combine it into 1. Or when somebody inserts the old column, I split it into 3. Ideally, in a DevOps world, I should designate some amount of time this situation exists. Maybe it's a month, maybe it's a year. And after that point in time, I ensure that all my applications are ready. I remove my triggers, I drop the full address column, and everything is using the 3 columns I added. Essentially what we're doing is we're deprecating an old feature. We're deprecating that column, and eventually we're removing it from the system. Now we want to use that same process for old views, old stored procedures, old functions, anything that falls out of use, anything we don't want to maintain. We want to ensure we clean up our system. These types of changes are hard in a database because I may have not just my application, we may have reporting software that users run, we may have ETL jobs. These days, more often than not, we may have an Excel spreadsheet that queries our data. All of those have to change to utilize a new schema. Each of these integration points is a form of technical debt. I highly suggest that you devote some time to removing this debt each month. Contact your users, provide notification, and slowly let them know they need to alter their system so that you can remove that debt. The other debt we have in database is old data. We have data that accumulates over time. Perhaps the lookup option is no longer used or never used. Maybe we have old logging data, old auditing data, old instrumentation. We may even have old transactional data that nobody will ever use. We often even have copies of this data because of it's in development departments, deployment departments. We may even have old data about our deployment process that we've just kept around, old backups of files, old backups of data. You want to be sure that you prune this over time. It takes resources to maintain this. It can be confusing when we have issues. And in general, it's just a bad idea to keep it around. We also want to be careful of abandoned objects in our database. So many databases I've found there are tables or views or stored procedures that are never used anymore. Now, in an earlier lesson, we discussed how we can monitor those. And really, that's important because it's the only way that your operations group will gain confidence that these objects are no longer needed and they can be removed. Often I found that I may need to track an object for a full year and ensure it's never used before I can actually delete it. Because after all, many organizations have some process or function that they perform only once a year on a database when they close out the previous year's business. So We often can't remove something until that point in time. Or if we do, we have to keep a backup and be ready to restore it immediately. Your company may allow you to remove objects sooner, especially if you archive them. An archival is a great development project and it should be treated as such because removing data, removing objects away is a whole process in itself. We want to be careful and treat it with the same respect we do with all the other software moved through our system. We want to develop scripts that will copy the data, save the schema, and delete objects. Make sure we have a reverse process to roll that back so that we can return those objects to the system if they're needed. And then we want to put that in version control and deploy it through a process to ensure that it's consistently built, it's tested, we evaluate it. Just like all of our other software, we want to test our archival process in the same way to ensure we don't affect the system.